In the summer of 1978, the quiet ranch community of Devine, Texas, was unsettled by the disappearance of 2-year-old Bobby Martinez. He had vanished without a trace during what should have been a perfect family gathering, leaving behind only a small red tricycle positioned at the edge of an abandoned well. But 30 years later, when a property surveyor stumbles upon evidence buried deep in that same well, he uncovers a truth so devastating it would unravel the very fabric of a family's carefully constructed silence and lead to the most horrifying revelation imaginable. The Martinez family barbecue had begun like countless others that blazing July afternoon. Grandmother Rosa's sprawling ranch stretched endlessly under the merciless Texas sun, its parched grass crackling beneath the feet of children who ran between the mesquite trees and weathered outbuildings. The air hung thick with the scent of burning charcoal and Rosa's famous dry rub, while cicadas droned their endless summer song from the shade of ancient live oaks. Bobby Martinez toddled among his relatives on unsteady legs, his chubby fingers clutching a sippy cup of watered-down lemonade. At 2 years old, he possessed that fearless curiosity that terrified mothers and delighted grandmothers. His dark hair stuck to his forehead with sweat, and his oversized Rangers t-shirt hung like a dress over his small frame. His 5-year-old sister Emma followed him everywhere that day, her protective instincts already fierce despite her young age. She wore a yellow sundress that Rosa had sewn for her birthday, and her dark braids were adorned with wildflowers she'd picked from the pasture that morning. Emma had appointed herself Bobby's guardian, constantly steering him away from the horses and warning him about the thorns on the prickly pear cacti. Uncle Ray stood near the smoking pit beer, already sweating in his grip despite the early hour. His voice carried across the yard as he argued with Rosa about something nobody quite caught. Teenage cousin Jake sprawled in the shade, his sullen expression reflecting his recent troubles at school. Miguel, the ranch hand, moved quietly between the animals, checking water troughs and mending a section of fence that had been damaged in the previous week's storm. The well sat at the property's eastern edge, abandoned for decades after newer equipment had been installed closer to the main house. Its stone rim stood barely 3 feet high, weathered smooth by years of wind and rain. By evening, that ancient well would become the center of every family nightmare. The first sign of trouble came when Rosa called everyone to the dinner table, and Bobby didn't appear from his usual hiding spot behind the chicken coop. Emma stood frozen beside the picnic table, her small hands twisting the hem of her yellow dress into tight knots. When asked where her little brother had gone, she pointed vaguely toward the eastern pasture and whispered, "He wanted to see the deep hole." The adults exchanged glances that carried the weight of every parent's worst fear. Rosa's ranch sprawled across 200 acres of unpredictable terrain, dotted with ravines, animal burrows, and that forgotten well that everyone had meant to cover properly but never quite managed to prioritize. They spread out in a frantic grid, calling Bobby's name across the scorching landscape. Ray stumbled slightly as he searched his afternoon drinking, evident in his unsteady gait. Jake emerged from his teenage sulk with surprising urgency, checking every barn and shed on the property. Miguel moved with practiced efficiency, his knowledge of the ranch's hidden dangers guiding his methodical search. It was Rosa who found the tricycle. The small red vehicle sat perfectly upright beside the old well's stone rim, as if Bobby had simply parked it there and walked away. But Bobby couldn't reach the pedals properly yet, always needing someone to push him. The positioning struck Rosa as wrong somehow, too deliberate for a toddler's abandonment. Miguel arrived first, when Rosa's scream pierced the evening air. He knelt beside the well and aimed his flashlight into the darkness below the beam, disappearing into depths that seemed to swallow light itself. The stone rim bore fresh scratches in the ancient mortar, and there pressed into the weathered surface like tiny fossils were the unmistakable imprints of small hands. Emma appeared at Rosa's side without anyone noticing her approach, her movements silent as a whisper. She stared down at the handprints with an expression that seemed far too knowing for a 5-year-old. When Rosa pulled her close, asking again what she had seen, Emma's voice emerged flat and emotionless. "Bobby climbed up to look," she said, her dark eyes never leaving those small impressions in the stone. "I told him not to, but he never listens to me." The well exhaled a breath of cool, stagnant air that carried the scent of deep earth and forgotten things. Sheriff's deputies arrived as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, their patrol cars kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air like a burial shroud. The well had been cordoned off with yellow tape that fluttered weakly in the occasional breeze, and powerful floodlights now illuminated the scene with harsh, unforgiving brightness. Detective Sarah Morales focused her attention immediately on the 3 men who'd been present during Bobby's disappearance. Each carried the weight of past mistakes that made them natural suspects in the eyes of law enforcement. Ray Martinez stood apart from the family group, his hands trembling as he lit his 4th cigarette in 20 minutes. The smell of stale beer clung to his work shirt, and his bloodshot eyes couldn't seem to focus on any one spot for more than a few seconds. When questioned about his whereabouts during the afternoon, his responses came slurred and contradictory. He'd been by the barbecue pit, then checking the horses, then maybe taking a walk to clear his head after arguing with his mother. His timeline shifted like sand with each retelling. 17-year-old Jake Martinez perched on the tailgate of his father's pickup truck, his usual teenage bravado replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Earlier that day, several family members had witnessed him playing too roughly with Bobby, spinning the toddler around until the child cried. Jake's explanation for his afternoon activities came stilted and rehearsed, as if he'd been preparing his answers before anyone thought to ask the questions. Miguel Hernandez stood with his hat clutched in weathered hands, his eyes darting between the deputies and the ranch's main gate. His English faltered under pressure, and Detective Morales noticed how his story about repairing fence posts kept changing in small but significant ways. Miguel had a documented history of livestock incidents on the ranch, a bull that had escaped due to an improperly latched gate, horses that had gotten into the grain storage because he'd forgotten to secure the feed room door. None of the 3 men had solid alibis for the crucial hour when Bobby vanished. Each possessed clear motives for wanting the investigation to focus elsewhere. Each had demonstrated poor judgment that could easily escalate into something far more sinister. Emma sat beside her grandmother throughout the questioning, her small voice occasionally offering details that seemed to implicate all 3 men equally. She remembered Uncle Ray yelling. She'd seen Jake near the well earlier. Miguel had been walking toward the eastern pasture. Her testimony felt almost too helpful, too precisely balanced in its suspicion. Detective Morales knelt to Emma's eye level as the portable floodlights cast dancing shadows across the child's face. The 5-year-old had wrapped herself around Rosa's leg like a vine, her small fingers working obsessively at something clutched in her palm. When Morales asked to see what she was holding, Emma reluctantly opened her hand to reveal the crushed remains of a daisy chain, its white petals now brown and wilted. "I was making it for Bobby," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the generator's hum. "But it broke when—" She trailed off, her dark eyes darting toward the well, before quickly looking away. The detective noted how Emma's story shifted, with each telling small details, changing like pieces of a puzzle that wouldn't quite fit together. First, she said Bobby had wandered off while she was picking flowers. Then she claimed she had been helping Grandma Rosa in the kitchen when her brother disappeared. When pressed gently for more details, she insisted she'd been playing by the chicken coop, and had only seen Bobby walking toward the deep hole from a distance. "Did you follow him, sweetheart?" Morales asked, her voice gentle but persistent. Emma shook her head violently, sending her braids whipping across her shoulders. "Mama says good girls don't go near scary places." But then, almost immediately, she added, "I told him the well was hungry. I told him it eats little boys who get too close." Rosa's face paled. "Emma, honey, where did you hear something like that?" The child looked confused, as if she'd surprised herself with the words. Her fingers resumed their restless destruction of the daisy chain, reducing the flowers to scattered fragments that drifted to the ground like confetti at a funeral. What disturbed Detective Morales most was how Emma seemed to know exactly where everyone had been during the crucial time period. She could place Uncle Ray by the barbecue pit, arguing with Grandma Rosa about his drinking. She remembered Jake sitting under the oak tree, sulking about being forced to attend the family gathering. She'd noticed Miguel walking along the fence line carrying wire and tools. Her observations were remarkably detailed for a 5-year-old, almost as if she'd been watching everyone, carefully keeping track of their movements for reasons she couldn't yet articulate. "Emma Shah," Morales said quietly, "did you see Bobby fall?" The child's entire body went rigid against her grandmother's leg. For a long moment, the only sounds were the distant lowing of cattle and the mechanical whir of the generator. "I wasn't supposed to be there," Emma finally whispered. Detective Morales turned her attention to Ray Martinez as the night deepened around the crime scene. The man's hands shook as he attempted to light another cigarette, the flame from his lighter wavering like his fractured memories of the afternoon. His alcohol-stained breath preceded every answer, and the way he avoided eye contact suggested guilt that ran deeper than mere intoxication. The family's reluctant testimonies painted a disturbing picture of Ray's recent descent. Rosa admitted that her son's drinking had worsened dramatically since losing his construction job 3 months prior. He'd been staying at the ranch more frequently, often arriving unannounced and already drunk, sleeping off his binges in the old bunkhouse behind the main residence. "Last month, I had to pull him off Bobby," Rosa confessed, her voice breaking. "The baby was crying, wouldn't stop, and Ray just grabbed him, shook him real hard, said Bobby needed to learn to be quiet like a man." Jake corroborated the incident with uncomfortable detail. Uncle Ray had Bobby by the shoulders, lifting him up and shaking him like a rag doll. Bobby's head was snapping back and forth. I thought he might really hurt him." When confronted about this incident, Ray's demeanor shifted from nervous to defensive. "Kids need discipline," he slurred. "Bobby's too soft. Someone's got to toughen him up before the world does it worse." His eyes held a cold hardness that made Detective Morales instinctively step back. Miguel, despite his own precarious position, reluctantly shared another disturbing encounter. 2 weeks ago, he discovered Ray passed out near the horse corral with Bobby wandering unsupervised nearby. The toddler had somehow gotten hold of a coil of rope and was dragging it behind him like a toy, completely unaware that he was steps away from a 20-foot drop into an irrigation ditch. "I take the rope away," Miguel explained in his broken English. "Tell Senor Ray the baby could get hurt. He just laugh and say, 'Bobby need to learn about danger sometime.'" Emma sat throughout these revelations with an expression that seemed far too mature for her 5 years. When Detective Morales asked if Uncle Ray had been mean to Bobby that afternoon, the child nodded solemnly. "He yelled at Bobby for spilling lemonade," Emma said, her small voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Said clumsy little boys deserve what they get." She paused, then added with startling precision, "That was at 3:47? I remember because the big hand was on the 9. The detective made a note of Emma's oddly specific timing Another piece of her surprisingly detailed observations. Jake Martinez slouched against the pickup truck's tailgate, his 17-year-old frame all sharp angles and barely contained aggression. Under the harsh glare of the floodlights, the scratches on his knuckles became visible. Fresh wounds that he claimed came from working on his motorcycle earlier that week. Detective Morales noted how his story about the afternoon kept evolving, each version more detailed than the last, as if he were constructing his alibi in real time. The family's accounts of Jake's recent behavior painted a troubling portrait. He'd been suspended from school twice in the past semester, for fighting once, for shoving a smaller boy down a flight of stairs after an argument over a lunch table. His mother had found disturbing drawings in his bedroom, violent sketches depicting faceless figures falling into dark holes, their stick-figure arms reaching desperately upward. Jake's been angry since his dad left, Rosa explained quietly, glancing toward her grandson with obvious concern. Gets into these moods where he just wants to hurt something. Usually it's just kicking fence posts or throwing rocks at bottles. But lately, that afternoon's incident had been witnessed by multiple family members. Jake had been teaching Bobby to be tougher, spinning the 2-year-old around by his arms until the child screamed and vomited into the grass. When Rosa intervened, Jake had shrugged with disturbing nonchalance. "I was just playing with him," Jake insisted, now his voice carrying an edge that made Detective Morales' hand drift unconsciously toward her radio. "Bobby's a crybaby. Someone needs to show him how the world really works." When pressed about his whereabouts during Bobby's disappearance, Jake's answers came too quickly, too polished. He'd been under the oak tree, he said, listening to music on his Walkman. But Miguel quietly mentioned seeing Jake walking toward the eastern pasture around the time Bobby vanished, carrying something that looked like rope. "Maybe I was walking around," Jake amended, his jaw tightening. "I get restless sitting still. Maybe I was checking the fence line, making sure everything was secure." His eyes held a calculating quality that suggested he understood exactly how his words would be interpreted. Emma watched Jake throughout the questioning with an intensity that seemed almost predatory. When Detective Morales asked if Jake had been mean to Bobby that day, the 5-year-old nodded slowly. "Jake said Bobby needed to learn about falling," Emma reported with her characteristic precision. "He said little kids who don't listen to big kids get what's coming to them." She paused, tilting her head thoughtfully. That was at 4:23, right before Bobby went to see the hungry hole. Again, that unsettling specificity about timing that no 5-year-old should possess. Miguel Hernandez twisted his weathered hat between calloused hands, his weathered face glistening with perspiration that had nothing to do with the oppressive Texas heat. Detective Morales noticed how his broken English became even more fractured under pressure, sentences collapsing into fragments that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify his activities during the crucial afternoon hours. His employment history at the Martinez Ranch revealed a pattern of costly negligence that had repeatedly put the family's livestock and property at risk. 6 months ago, his failure to properly secure a gate had allowed prize breeding cattle to escape onto the highway, resulting in a 3-car accident and thousands of dollars in damages. Just last month, he'd left a water valve open overnight, flooding the eastern pasture where the old well sat hidden among the tall grass. "Miguel knows this ranch better than anyone," Rosa had confided earlier to Detective Morales. "Every dangerous spot, every hidden hazard. If something happened to Bobby out there, Miguel would know exactly where to look, or where to hide evidence." When questioned about his movements that afternoon, Miguel's story shifted like quicksand. First, he claimed to have been repairing fence posts along the northern boundary. Then he remembered checking water troughs in the southern pasture. Finally, he admitted to walking near the eastern section just to make sure everything was safe for the children. His fear of deportation became apparent when he repeatedly mentioned his expired work visa, his wife and children in Mexico, who depended on the money he sent home every month. "I need this job, Senora," he pleaded with Detective Morales. "My family, they have nothing without me working here." The desperation in his voice suggested a man capable of extreme measures to protect his livelihood. If Bobby had witnessed Miguel's latest act of negligence, perhaps another flooded area or damaged equipment, the ranch hand might have felt cornered into silencing the only witness. Other family members reluctantly shared additional concerns. Jake mentioned seeing Miguel near the old well earlier that morning, carrying a coil of rope and muttering to himself in Spanish. Ray, despite his intoxication, clearly remembered Miguel approaching Bobby around mid-afternoon, kneeling down to the child's level and speaking in urgent whispers. Emma observed Miguel throughout the questioning with that same unsettling intensity she directed at the other suspects. When asked if the ranch hand had seemed worried about something that day, she nodded with her characteristic solemnity. Miguel was talking to Bobby about staying away from dangerous places, she reported. He said, "Little boys who see things they shouldn't see sometimes disappear forever." She paused, her dark eyes reflecting the floodlights like mirrors. That was at 4:15, right before Bobby said he wanted to be brave like a big boy. 3 months after Bobby Martinez disappeared into the Texas earth, the investigation had settled into a frustrating stalemate. Detective Morales continued pursuing leads that seemed to evaporate under scrutiny, while the 3 primary suspects maintained their contradictory stories with stubborn consistency. Ray's alcoholism had worsened to the point where his testimony became increasingly unreliable. Jake had been sent to military school by his desperate mother, removing him from immediate questioning. Miguel had quietly disappeared one night in October, leaving behind only a note apologizing to Rosa for failing to protect the little one. But it was Emma Martinez who exhibited the most disturbing changes as autumn settled over the ranch like a heavy shroud. The 5-year-old had stopped speaking above a whisper, her voice barely audible even when sitting directly beside someone. Rosa found herself leaning closer and closer to catch Emma's words, which came in fragments that seemed carefully edited as if the child were filtering every thought before allowing it to escape. More troubling was Emma's new phobia of anything resembling a hole or depression in the ground. She would no longer walk near the storm drains in town, refusing to step over sidewalk grates, or even approach the shallow depression where the old dog bowl sat on the porch. When Rosa planted bulbs in the garden, Emma fled to her bedroom and remained there for hours, emerging only when the small holes had been filled and covered with mulch. The child had taken to carrying a small notebook everywhere, its pages filled with careful drawings of the ranch layout. Every building, every fence line, every tree was rendered in precise detail by her small hands. But the eastern section where the well stood remained conspicuously blank, as if that portion of the property had been erased from her memory entirely. Sleep brought no relief. Emma's nightmares came nightly now, sending her screaming into Rosa's bed with stories of the hungry hole that called to children in voices they couldn't resist. She would wake clutching phantom daisies, her small hands working frantically at air as if trying to repair something that had been irreparably broken. Most unsettling was how Emma seemed to know things she shouldn't know. When Detective Morales mentioned interviewing a witness they hadn't previously discussed, Emma would nod and say, "The lady in the blue truck who drove by at 4:31. When new evidence emerged, the child would react with resigned acceptance rather than surprise, as if she'd been expecting each revelation. Rosa noticed that Emma had stopped playing entirely. The child would sit for hours watching the eastern horizon with an expression of profound guilt that belonged on the face of someone decades older. 30 years passed like a slow hemorrhage, each anniversary of Bobby's disappearance reopening wounds that never quite healed. The old Martinez ranch had changed hands twice since Rosa's death in 1995. The property eventually purchased by a Dallas developer who planned to subdivide the sprawling acreage into luxury home sites. It was during the preliminary survey in March 2008 that the past finally surrendered its secrets. Property surveyor Tom Kellison was mapping the eastern boundary when his measuring rod struck something solid 15 feet down the abandoned well. The impact sent a hollow echo reverberating through the stone chamber, a sound that seemed to carry more weight than physics should allow. Following proper protocol, Kellison immediately contacted the county sheriff's department, though he suspected he already knew what lay hidden in those depths. The recovery operation took 3 days. Powerful pumps drained decades of accumulated rainwater and debris, revealing a scene that had remained undisturbed since that terrible afternoon in 1978. Bobby Martinez's remains rested at the bottom of the well, his small bones scattered but largely intact, still wearing the remnants of the oversized Rangers t-shirt that had been his grandmother's pride. But it was the other evidence that transformed a presumed accident into something far more complex and disturbing. Coiled beside Bobby's remains lay a length of rope thin and brightly coloured, the type used for children's jump ropes or playground activities. The rope showed signs of fraying consistent with repeated use, and its length suggested it had been deliberately measured to reach from the well's rim to its bottom. Crime scene technicians noted fresh knots tied at regular intervals, as if someone had created handholds for climbing. More puzzling were the water-damaged family photographs scattered around the scene like fallen leaves. Most depicted the Martinez family at various gatherings over the years: birthdays, holidays, casual ranch activities. The images had been carefully wrapped in what appeared to be a child's plastic lunch container, suggesting someone had made a deliberate effort to preserve them even in the well's humid environment. Among the photographs, investigators discovered a small item that would prove crucial to understanding the truth. A diary bound in faded pink vinyl, its pages swollen with moisture but still legible. The childish handwriting on the cover identified it clearly. Emma's secret book, Do Not Read. Detective Patricia Vance, now heading the cold case review, opened the diary with latex-gloved hands. The first entry was dated July 15, 1978, the day Bobby Martinez disappeared. The words, written in a 5-year-old's careful script, would finally explain 30 years of carefully guarded silence. Detective Vance turned the diary's moisture-warped pages with infinite care, each entry revealing fragments of a 5-year-old's desperate attempt to process an unthinkable tragedy. The childish handwriting wavered between careful print and wild scrawl, as if Emma's small hand had struggled to keep pace with her racing thoughts. July 15th, 1978. Bobby fell in the hungry hole. I tried to get him out, but the rope was too short. I made it longer with daisy stems, but they broke. Bobby was crying, "Mama, Mama," but nobody could hear except me. I told him, "I'm coming, Bobby, I'm coming," but I couldn't reach. Detective Vance paused, studying the entry more closely. The timeline Emma had provided to investigators 30 years ago hadn't mentioned her presence at the well during Bobby's fall. She'd claimed to see him walking toward the eastern pasture from a distance. Yet this diary suggested intimate knowledge of his final moments. July 16th, 1978. I put rope down again today when everybody was sleeping. Made it from jump rope and washing line. Bobby wasn't crying anymore. I dropped pictures so he wouldn't be lonely. Told Mama I lost my diary, but I hid it with Bobby so he has something to look at. The methodical nature of Emma's rescue attempts became clearer with each entry. She had systematically gathered rope from various sources around the ranch. The children's jump rope from the porch clothesline from behind the bunkhouse, even twine from the tack room. The knotted handholds that crime scene technicians had discovered weren't random. They were the desperate engineering of a 5-year-old trying to create a ladder long enough to reach her brother. July 20th, 1978. Uncle Ray is very mad and drinks more beer. Jake got sent to his room for breaking fence. Miguel looks scared all the time. Nobody knows I was there when Bobby wanted to see inside the hole. Nobody knows I tried to save him. I can't tell because then they'll know I was bad for not stopping him. Detective Vance noted the subtle shift in Emma's narrative. The child's initial entries suggested she'd witnessed Bobby's accidental fall, but this entry implied a more complex sequence of events. The phrase, "when Bobby wanted to see inside the hole," suggested the fall hadn't been entirely unexpected. July 24th, 1978. I dream about Bobby calling my name. He says, "Emma, why didn't you catch me?" I tell him I tried, but my hands were too small. In the dream, he forgives me. But when I wake up, I remember I was playing King of the Mountain and told him he couldn't be king because he was too little. The final entry Detective Vance examined was dated a full month after Bobby's disappearance. The handwriting had deteriorated into barely legible scratches, as if the child had been writing in darkness or through tears. August 15th, 1978. Mama says we might move away from the ranch. I can't leave Bobby alone in the hungry hole. What if he gets scared without his pictures? What if he forgets what Mama and Daddy look like? I have to keep the secret forever and ever, so nobody knows I was the reason he wanted to prove he was brave. Detective Vance continued deeper into Emma's diary, her latex gloves turning the pages with increasing dread, as the true sequence of events emerged from a 5-year-old's tormented confessions. The entries that followed painted a picture so devastating that even 30 years of police work hadn't prepared her for the full scope of this family's tragedy. July 15th, 1978. Later, we were playing King of the Mountain on the stone circle. I was winning because I'm bigger. Bobby kept trying to climb up, but I kept pushing him back down. I said only big kids can be king. He got mad and said he was brave like Jake. I said prove it. I said if you're so brave, look down in the scary hole. I pushed him to make him look. He went over the edge and I heard the splash sound and then crying. The clinical language of a child attempting to process unthinkable guilt couldn't soften the horror of what had transpired. Emma hadn't merely witnessed Bobby's fall. She had been the direct cause of it. Her game of King of the Mountain had turned lethal in an instant of sibling rivalry and childhood cruelty. July 15th, 1978. Nighttime. I climbed down with the jump rope, but it was too short. Bobby was in the water at the bottom, crying "Mama, Mama." I told him, I'm sorry, but he just kept crying. The water was dark and smelled bad. I threw down my daisy chain so he would know I was trying to help. I stayed there until after dark, trying to make the rope longer, but everything kept breaking. Detective Vance could envision the scene with horrible clarity. A 5-year-old Emma desperately attempting to reach her drowning brother, working frantically to extend her makeshift rescue rope, while Bobby's cries grew weaker in the depths below. The daisy chain found with his remains hadn't been dropped accidentally. It had been Emma's first desperate attempt at creating a lifeline. July 16th, 1978. Bobby stopped crying sometime in the dark. I kept calling his name, but he wouldn't answer. I lowered down more rope and pictures so he wouldn't be scared. I can't tell anybody what happened, because then they'll know I was mean to Bobby. They'll know I killed my baby brother. Mama will hate me forever. The photographs scattered around Bobby's remains took on a new heartbreaking significance. They weren't evidence of some unknown perpetrator's psychological game. They were the desperate offerings of a guilt-stricken child trying to comfort her dead brother in the only way she knew how. July 18th, 1978. I told the police lady that Uncle Ray was mean and Jake was rough and Miguel was scared. I made it sound like they might hurt Bobby so nobody would think about me being there. I remember exactly when everybody was where, because I was watching to make sure nobody saw me at the hungry hole trying to save Bobby. Finally, the pieces fell into place. Emma's unnaturally precise recall of everyone's whereabouts hadn't been remarkable memory for a 5-year-old. It had been the calculated observations of a child desperately constructing an alibi while her brother died 20 feet away. In November 2008, Detective Vance sat across from Emma Martinez Chen in a sterile interrogation room. The diary spread between them like evidence of a 30-year-old crime. The 43-year-old woman bore little resemblance to the frightened 5-year-old who had watched 3 innocent men fall under suspicion for her brother's death. Emma's dark hair was streaked with premature grey, and her hands displayed the same restless fidgeting that had characterized her childhood, fingers constantly working at invisible objects, repairing phantom daisy chains that would never hold. "I've carried this every single day," Emma whispered, her voice still barely audible, even in adulthood. "Every anniversary, every time I see a child Bobby's age, every time someone mentions the ranch. I see his face looking up at me from that water, and I hear myself saying, 'Prove you're brave,' over and over again." The confession that followed laid bare 3 decades of carefully maintained deception. Emma detailed how she'd systematically planted evidence of the 3 men's potential guilt-feeding investigators' precise observations that would cast suspicion on Ray, Jake, and Miguel while establishing her own absence from the critical scene. She'd learned to weaponize truth, sharing real instances of Ray's violence, Jake's aggression, and Miguel's negligence while omitting her own fatal moment of sibling cruelty. "Miguel disappeared because he thought I'd seen him do something terrible," Emma continued, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Jake's military school destroyed his adolescence. Uncle Ray drank himself to death believing everyone thought he was a child killer. And I let them all suffer because I was too terrified to admit I'd pushed my baby brother into that well." The psychological cost of her silence had been enormous. Emma had never married, never had children, and had spent her adult life working as a grief counsellor, as if helping other families navigate loss could somehow balance the scales of her childhood guilt. She'd return to the ranch every year on Bobby's birthday, leaving flowers at the well's rim and whispering apologies to the darkness below. As they walked toward the parking lot, Detective Vance looked at the broken woman one last time. The real journey was just beginning. Legal proceedings, family reconciliation, the painful process of exhuming Bobby for proper burial beside his grandmother. In the end, that was the lesson evil might hide behind familiar faces. But the truth endures no matter how deeply buried. As they moved toward her patrol car, Detective Vance squeezed Emma's trembling hand. 30 years is long enough to carry this alone, she said gently. Bobby can finally rest now, and maybe you can too. They stepped toward healing, toward a future
Thank you
they
for
would
listening to
build
Brody's
one
stories.
day at a time.
Until we meet again.